The night was suffocatingly quiet when Anna first heard the scraping noise. It was faint, like the soft drag of metal against stone, but persistent enough to pull her from the fragile edge of sleep. She lived alone in a small, remote house at the edge of a sprawling forest, a place chosen for its solitude after years of city chaos. But tonight, solitude felt more like isolation. Rubbing her eyes, Anna sat up in bed and strained to hear. The sound was there again, louder this time. It seemed to be coming from outside. Her heart quickened as her mind raced through possibilities. A raccoon? Maybe a stray dog? Yet something about the rhythm of the noise unsettled her. It felt deliberate, purposeful. Summoning her courage, Anna grabbed the flashlight from her bedside table and crept to the window. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the dense tree line that bordered her property. For a moment, everything was still, and she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. Then, just as she was about to step back, a shadow moved, a fleeting figure that disappeared too quickly to identify. Anna's stomach twisted. She locked all the doors earlier, didn't she? Panic clawed at her throat as she tiptoed to the front door to double-check. The deadbolt was secure, but her relief was short-lived. The scraping noise returned, this time louder and unmistakably closer, coming from the direction of the kitchen. She froze, her breath hitching. The sound wasn't outside anymore. It was inside. Clutching the flashlight like a weapon, she stepped cautiously into the hallway. The beam wavered in her trembling hands, casting jittery shadows on the walls. The kitchen loomed ahead, its doorway an ominous rectangle of darkness. As she approached, the noise stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the sound itself. She swung the flashlight into the room, illuminating the counters, the table, the floor. Nothing. Everything was exactly as it should be. And then she saw it. A single muddy footprint on the tiled floor, stark and fresh. It wasn't hers. Anna's mind reeled. She hadn't heard any doors open. How could someone have gotten inside? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, sharp creak directly above her. Her blood ran cold. The attic. She had never used the attic. It was little more than a crawl space, accessible only by a rickety pull-down ladder in the hallway ceiling. She backed away, her eyes fixed on the faint outline of the attic hatch. Another creak. Whoever, or whatever, was up there was moving. Desperation overtook fear as Anna dashed to the front door. Her trembling hands fumbled with the locks, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely think. Finally, the door swung open, and she ran out into the night, not stopping until she reached her car parked at the end of the driveway. She locked the doors and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. The police arrived within 15 minutes, though it felt like hours. 2 officers entered the house while Anna waited outside, huddled in a blanket provided by a neighbor who had wandered over to see the commotion. When the officers emerged, their faces were grim. "There's no one in the house now," one of them said, "but you might want to take a look at this." Reluctantly, Anna followed them back inside. In the attic, they found a small, makeshift sleeping area, an old blanket, a half-eaten sandwich, and several empty water bottles. More disturbingly, they found a collection of photos. They were all of Anna, taken through her windows, around her property, and even inside her home. Anna moved out the next day, leaving behind the house, the forest, and any semblance of peace she once had. To this day, she doesn't know how long her uninvited guest had been living in her home or what their intentions were. All she knows is that she was lucky to have gotten out when she did. The part that haunts her the most? The police told her they found no signs of forced entry.
Story number 2.
It was supposed to be a quick trip, a weekend getaway to unwind from the stresses of daily life. Emily and her boyfriend Mark had rented a secluded cabin deep in the mountains, far from the noise of the city. The place was perfect. Rustic charm, no cell service, and surrounded by endless miles of dense, whispering woods. The first night passed uneventfully. The couple enjoyed wine by the fireplace, laughed about the work emails they were intentionally ignoring, and marveled at the vast, star-filled sky. But by the second night, something shifted. Emily woke abruptly in the dead of night. A strange sensation prickled the back of her neck, a nagging feeling that she wasn't alone. She glanced over at Mark, who was snoring softly beside her. She told herself it was nothing, just the unease that came with being in an unfamiliar place. But then she heard it, a faint tapping sound. At first, she thought it was the wind knocking a branch against the window, but as she strained to listen, the taps became rhythmic, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. They seemed to come from the front door. Her heart pounded in her chest as she gently shook Mark awake. "Mark, she whispered urgently. "Someone's at the door." Mark groaned, still half asleep. "It's probably an animal. Go back to bed." But Emily couldn't shake the feeling. "Please," she insisted, "just check." Reluctantly, Mark grabbed a flashlight and shuffled to the door. Emily followed close behind, clutching a blanket tightly around herself. When Mark swung the door open, they were greeted by nothing but the cool night air and the faint rustling of leaves. "See? No one's here," Mark said, shutting the door with a sigh. "It's probably just your imagination." Emily tried to believe him, but as they climbed back into bed, the uneasy feeling remained. She barely slept, her ears straining for the slightest sound. The next morning, Emily went outside to investigate. She found nothing unusual, no footprints, no signs of animals. But as she circled back toward the front porch, something caught her eye. Scratched into the wood of the door, faint but unmistakable, were 3 words: "Let me in." She froze, her breath hitching in her throat. When she showed Mark, he dismissed it as a cruel prank by some local kids. "We're in the middle of nowhere," Emily argued. "Who would even come out here?" Mark shrugged it off, but Emily couldn't shake her growing dread. They spent the rest of the day hiking and trying to enjoy the scenery, but every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set her on edge. That night, the tapping returned. This time, it wasn't just the door. The sound echoed from all around the cabin, windows, walls, even the roof. Mark tried to act brave, but Emily could see the fear creeping into his eyes as he searched for an explanation. He armed himself with a fire poker and told Emily to stay in the bedroom while he checked the house. Minutes passed, each one stretching into an eternity. Emily sat huddled on the bed, clutching her phone despite its uselessness. Then she heard it, a low, guttural whisper just outside the bedroom window. "Let me in." Emily's blood ran cold. Slowly, she turned her head toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but a shadow moved on the other side, a tall, spindly figure with limbs too long and movements too jerky to be human. She screamed. Mark came rushing back, his face pale. "What is it? What's wrong?" "Something's outside," she stammered. "I saw it." Mark peeked through the curtains, but the figure was gone. He tried to reassure her, but his own fear was palpable. "We'll leave first thing in the morning," he promised. The night dragged on, every sound amplified in the oppressive silence. When dawn finally broke, they wasted no time packing up and leaving the cabin behind. It wasn't until they were halfway down the mountain that Emily noticed something on the back window of their car. Scrawled in the same jagged handwriting as before were the words, "I'll follow you."
Story number 3.
Claire had always been fascinated by old, abandoned buildings. She called it urban exploration. Her friends called it reckless. But the thrill of uncovering forgotten spaces outweighed their warnings. When she heard about the Hollow Hills Asylum, she couldn't resist. The asylum had been shut down decades ago after a fire claimed the lives of several patients and staff. Local legends whispered of strange shadows, ghostly screams, and the feeling of being watched. For Claire, it sounded like the perfect adventure. She arrived just before dusk, armed with a flashlight, her camera, and a notebook. The building loomed ahead, its crumbling facade covered in ivy, its broken windows like empty eyes staring into the void. Pushing through the rusted gate, she felt an odd chill despite the summer heat. Inside, the air was damp and thick with mildew. The peeling paint hung from the walls like jagged scars, and the floor was littered with debris, old furniture, shattered glass, and charred remnants of the fire. Claire began snapping pictures, her camera's flash momentarily lighting the darkness. As she ventured deeper, the silence grew oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards and distant drip of water made her jump. But what unsettled her most was the feeling, like someone was watching her. She told herself it was just nerves. Then, in one of the patient rooms, she found something strange. On the wall, someone had scratched deep, jagged words into the plaster. "Leave while you can." She hesitated. It was probably just the work of other explorers, trying to scare people. She pressed on. The next room was worse. It had once been a common area, but now it was filled with rows of decaying chairs facing a large, cracked mirror. On the dusty floor, Claire noticed faint footprints leading from the door to the mirror. Bare feet, much smaller than hers. Her stomach churned as she stared at the mirror, her flashlight beam reflecting back at her. The room was empty, except for her, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She turned to leave, but just as she stepped out, she caught movement in the corner of her eye. She spun around, shining her light at the mirror. For a split second, she saw it, a figure standing just behind her reflection. Pale, thin, and featureless except for two dark pits where eyes should have been. Claire screamed and bolted down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. She didn't stop until she reached the lobby, her chest heaving. As she leaned against the wall to catch her breath, she heard it. Soft, shuffling footsteps coming from the hallway she had just fled. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. No response. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Her flashlight flickered and went out. Panicking, she fumbled with it until the beam returned. When she pointed it down the hallway, there was nothing there. But the footsteps continued, now accompanied by a faint, raspy whisper. "Stay with me." Claire turned and ran for the exit. She didn't look back, didn't care about the equipment she left behind. She burst out into the night and didn't stop running until she reached her car. When she finally dared to look back at the asylum, she saw something in one of the upper windows. A face, pale and featureless, with dark, hollow eyes, staring back at her. She never returned to Hollow Hills Asylum. But sometimes, late at night, she swears she hears faint whispers outside her bedroom window, calling her name.
Story number 4.
Jason hated long drives at night, but his new job required him to travel often. It was on one of these late-night trips along an isolated stretch of highway that he had his most terrifying experience. The road was empty except for his car, the headlights cutting through the inky darkness. His GPS said he had another 2 hours to go, and the monotony of the drive was beginning to wear on him. Tall trees lined both sides of the road, their branches stretching overhead like skeletal fingers. Every now and then the moonlight would filter through, casting eerie patterns across the asphalt. Then, out of nowhere, his radio crackled. Jason hadn't been listening to music, and the sudden noise startled him. He glanced at the dashboard, but the radio was off. Yet the static persisted, faint and rhythmic. It almost sounded like breathing. He turned the volume knob, but it did nothing. The static grew louder, and beneath it, Jason thought he heard something else, whispering. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was cold and urgent. His heart began to race. What the hell was going on? And then, the headlights caught something up ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. Jason slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car came to a halt. His heart was pounding as he squinted through the windshield. The figure, a woman, stood motionless, her face obscured by a tangled mess of long, dark hair. She wore a tattered white dress that fluttered in the breeze, though there was no wind. "Are you okay?" Jason called out, rolling down his window slightly. The woman didn't respond. She just stood there, her head tilted as if she were listening to something he couldn't hear. Unease crept over him. Something wasn't right. He considered driving around her, but the road was narrow, and he didn't want to risk the ditch. Instead, he honked the horn. The woman's head snapped toward him so fast it was unnatural. Jason's breath caught in his throat as she took a step closer, her movements jerky and disjointed. He could see her face now, pale, gaunt, with eyes so dark they looked like empty sockets. Her lips parted, and though he couldn't hear her over the engine, he knew she was whispering. Fear overwhelmed him. Jason threw the car into reverse. But before he could back away, the woman suddenly appeared at his window. 1 second, she was standing in the road. The next, her face was pressed against the glass, her blackened fingers clawing at the window. "Let me in," she rasped, her voice a low, guttural growl. Jason screamed, slamming the car into drive and flooring the gas. The woman disappeared from view as his car sped forward, but the whispering didn't stop. It was in his ears now, louder and more insistent. "Let me in, let me in, let me in." The words echoed in his head as he drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. When he finally reached a gas station, he skidded to a stop and stumbled out of the car, trembling. The attendant gave him a strange look as Jason tried to explain what had happened. He didn't even care if he sounded crazy. "I'm telling you, she was on the road, and then she was at my window," he said, his voice shaking. The attendant's face paled. "You were on Hollow Road, weren't you?" Jason nodded. The attendant leaned closer, his voice low. "That's the Lady of Hollow Road. She died in a car accident years ago. They say she looks for someone to take her home, but if you let her in..." He trailed off, shaking his head. Jason didn't need him to finish. He knew he'd come far too close to finding out. That night, Jason stayed at a motel and refused to drive the rest of the way. Even now, he avoids late-night drives, but sometimes, when he's alone in his car, he swears he hears faint whispers asking to be let in.
Story number 5.
Ava was an artist, one of those who thrived on solitude and inspiration drawn from desolate places. When she found an ad for a cheap studio in an old, creaky building downtown, she jumped at the opportunity. The landlord warned her it wasn't in the best condition, but she didn't care. The peeling wallpaper, dim lighting, and drafty windows only added to its charm. It was exactly what she needed to create her next masterpiece. The first few days were uneventful. Ava spent her time painting, often losing track of the hours until she realized it was dark outside. The only strange thing was the door to the storage room at the back of the studio. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't get it to open. The landlord claimed it was just an old, jammed door and not worth worrying about. But Ava couldn't ignore it. Every time she passed by the door, she felt a strange pull, as though something on the other side was aware of her presence. One night, as she worked on a particularly complex piece, she heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the storage room. She froze, brush in hand, and listened. The sound was steady, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. She told herself it was the old pipes, or perhaps a draft, but as the night wore on, the tapping grew louder. It sounded almost like knocking. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she approached the door, pressing her ear against the wood. For a moment, there was silence. Then a whisper. Faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Help me." Ava stumbled back, her heart pounding. She wanted to leave, but the rational part of her brain convinced her it was just her imagination. She decided to go home and come back in the morning. But as she gathered her things, the knocking resumed, faster and more urgent. She couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing a crowbar from the corner, she approached the door and jammed the tool into the frame. With a loud creak, the door finally gave way. The room beyond was pitch black. She shone her flashlight inside, revealing nothing but dust, cobwebs, and a single chair in the center of the room. It faced a bare wall. On the wall, she noticed scratches, as if someone had clawed at it with desperate force. Her stomach churned as she stepped closer. That's when she saw it. Carved into the wall, in jagged, uneven letters, were the words, "Don't look behind you." The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Slowly, she turned around, her flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated the doorway. Standing just outside the room was a figure. Its face was pale and expressionless, its eyes dark pits that seemed to swallow the light. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but Ava felt an overwhelming sense of malice radiating from it. She screamed and ran, not stopping until she was outside and in her car. She didn't return to the studio, not even to collect her paintings. When she tried to contact the landlord to break her lease, she discovered the building had been abandoned for years. Ava never painted again. She swore that sometimes, in the middle of the night, she could still hear the faint sound of tapping as if something was trying to find its way to her.
Story number 6.
Mia loved photography, especially exploring forgotten places to capture their haunting beauty. When she stumbled upon an online forum discussing the Devil's Hollow, an abandoned village deep in the woods, she knew she had to go. The place was infamous. Its residents had disappeared without a trace nearly a century ago, leaving behind crumbling houses, a decrepit church, and chilling whispers of curses. Her friends refused to join her, so she went alone, armed with her camera and a backpack. The trail to Devil's Hollow was overgrown, barely visible under the blanket of fallen leaves. By the time she reached the outskirts of the village, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward her. The village was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the place itself resented her presence. She ignored the unease creeping up her spine and started taking pictures, marveling at the eerie beauty of the decaying structures. Her camera's flash lit up the interiors of houses long abandoned, revealing broken furniture, shattered windows, and graffiti scrawled by thrill-seekers who'd been brave or foolish enough to come before her. But in the church, something was different. The walls were unmarked, and the pews, though dusty, were intact. At the front of the sanctuary stood a large, tarnished mirror. The mirror was mesmerizing, even in its dilapidated state. The ornate frame was covered in strange symbols she didn't recognize, and the glass seemed to shimmer faintly as though it were alive. Curious, Mia raised her camera and snapped a photo. When the flash went off, something in the mirror flickered, just for a moment. Mia froze, staring at the glass. Her reflection stared back, but there was something wrong. It was subtle at first, her reflection's head tilted slightly to the side, though Mia was standing straight. Then, slowly, the figure in the mirror smiled. Mia wasn't smiling. Her stomach dropped and her breath quickened. She took a step back, but her reflection didn't move. Instead, it raised a hand and pressed it against the inside of the glass. A faint, muffled sound followed, like fingernails scraping. Mia's instincts screamed at her to run, but she couldn't look away. Her reflection's face began to change, twisting into something grotesque. Its eyes darkened, hollow pits that seemed to pull her in. The smile stretched wider, too wide for a human face. "Stay," it whispered. The voice wasn't hers. It was deep, guttural, and filled with malice. Mia bolted, leaving her camera behind. She didn't stop running until she was well outside the village, her lungs burning and her heart pounding like a drum. She didn't care about the photos or the equipment. All she wanted was to get as far away as possible. When she finally reached her car, she jumped inside and locked the doors, gasping for air. But just as she started the engine, she glanced at the rearview mirror. Her reflection wasn't her own. The thing in the mirror grinned, its hollow eyes fixed on hers.
Story number 7.
Ben had always loved camping. The solitude, the fresh air, the crackling of the campfire. It was his escape from the chaos of life. One weekend, he decided to try a new location, Black Pine Forest, a remote area that few people dared to explore. There were rumors about strange occurrences, but Ben dismissed them as local folklore. He set up camp deep within the forest, where the trees were so thick they blocked most of the sunlight. By nightfall, the area was shrouded in near total darkness. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. As he sat by the fire, eating his dinner, he noticed the woods had grown unnervingly quiet. No insects, no wind, just silence. He shrugged it off, thinking it was odd, but nothing to worry about. Then a twig snapped somewhere behind him. Ben froze, gripping his flashlight. He scanned the trees, the beam bouncing off the twisted trunks and dense undergrowth. "Hello?" he called out, his voice steady despite the unease creeping in. No answer. He chuckled nervously to himself. "It's probably just an animal," he thought, tossing another log onto the fire to push back the darkness. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Later, as he crawled into his tent, he couldn't shake the sensation. Lying on his sleeping bag, he listened intently, his ears straining for any sound. Hours passed in tense silence until he finally drifted off. He woke to the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and circling his tent. Ben's heart raced as he lay perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. He reached for his flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint, flickering light. Nothing moved. Relieved, he stepped out to rekindle the fire. As he crouched, gathering kindling, his flashlight beam caught something. Bare footprints in the dirt, too large to be human. He stared at them, his blood running cold. The prints led away from his campsite and into the forest. Gripping his flashlight tightly, he shone the beam into the trees. At first, there was nothing, just the endless tangle of branches. Then he saw it. A figure stood just beyond the edge of the light. Its body was impossibly tall and thin, with arms that hung unnaturally low. Its face was blank, featureless except for two hollow, glowing eyes. It didn't move, but Ben felt its gaze pierce through him. Panic set in, and he stumbled back toward his tent. As he zipped it shut, he heard the footsteps again, this time faster, circling closer and closer. The tent fabric rippled as if something brushed against it. Ben held his breath, clutching a hunting knife he'd packed. The footsteps stopped directly outside. "Leave," he whispered, barely audible. Then came the voice, a low, guttural growl that echoed through the still night. "You're in my woods." The tent suddenly collapsed inward as though something heavy pressed down on it. Ben screamed, slashing wildly with the knife, but there was nothing to fight. When the weight lifted, he bolted from the tent and ran. He didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't care that he left everything behind. It wasn't until dawn broke and he reached the edge of the forest that he finally stopped. He turned to look back one last time. Far off, at the tree line, the figure stood watching him. Ben never went camping again.